Hi guys, welcome to my channel. In today's video I'm talking about photography, and I'm more specifically talking about how to deal with camera settings. The most common question that I get asked about photography is how do I understand camera settings? And I decided to create a video because I've been asked this question so many times. I figured I might as well create a YouTube video about it because I absolutely love photography, and I think that camera settings are like the best thing ever because you can literally customize how an image looks. But a lot of people are scared to shoot in manual because they don't understand camera settings. Well, after this video you will, and you'll be able to shoot in manual. Trust me. So there are three things that you should know if you want to talk about camera settings. There is ISO, aperture / f-stop, those pretty much mean the same thing, and then shutter speed. All three of these factors control the image and how it looks, and if you change one of these factors, the image is going to change completely. And it is all about learning how to manipulate these camera settings in order to create an image that you love and that you'll be able to really be proud of. So if you look at this day right here, it is super bright. It is about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but if you live in Texas, you know this is when it gets hot. It is really hot. It's really bright out. I'm actually under our patio, so I'm in the shade, but behind me it's super light, super bright. And if I actually go into the light, you know, it's really bright. So that is why I decided to be in the shade, but this is a little bit tricky because I wanted to balance the brightness of my background with the fact that I was in a shaded spot. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't too dark and that this background wasn't too light, even though it's still pretty light. But you get my gist, right? So I'm going to go through all my camera settings that I have on my camera currently. So right now my shutter speed is at 250th of a second. My f-stop / aperture is 1.8, and my ISO is 250. So those are my camera settings right now, and I'm going to explain each and every single one to you. So let's start with aperture / f-stop, which is pretty much the same thing, but people like to call them by different names. Right now, like I said, mine is at 1.8, and this is actually the secret to a really professional looking image, knowing the aperture. Because if you don't know the aperture, then you don't know this little secret, but I want to tell you about it. You know when you see like a really professional photographer and they create like these really like cool image where the subject is in focus but then the background is super blurry, so the entire image looks really professional and really like high class, you know? So in most of my videos, such as my makeup videos and like these talking videos that I film for you guys, my aperture is at 1.8 because I love that blurry background. It looks great in videos because I'm able to make myself pop on your screen, you know? So right now I have my aperture at 1.8 because I wanted the background to be very blurry. Even though it's very bright, I still wanted it to be blurry because if you have a lower aperture, then more light comes in and you have a blurrier background. However, if you have a higher aperture, let me raise the aperture up to maybe 4.0, you can see that the image is less lit and also the background is less blurry. If I raise the aperture up to 11, it's even darker. And you can see that you can almost very clearly see all these trees, and you can sort of see the background. Even though I am still in focus, you can still see the background behind me. So this is a sharper image. So I don't really like to use a higher aperture for most of the time. I only use a high aperture if I'm shooting something like very dark and gloomy and dramatic, and I want to make it even more so by sharpening the image and making the tones slightly more dark and rich. I also like to shoot with a higher aperture, maybe like 8 or maybe even 11 when I'm shooting landscapes, when I was shooting the beach this summer, just things like that. But most of the time my aperture is at 1.8 because that is honestly what I prefer. I like to shoot a lot of portraits, so 1.8 is perfect for me because my portraits end up looking very professional, very ethereal if I want them to be, and you can see me clearly right in this video, but you can also see that the background is very blurry. So this is what people usually want when they ask you for a photo. They usually want the background to be quite blurry. Of course, don't limit yourself. Even in portraits, I have gone with a higher aperture and it ends up creating some really cool effects, some really cool portraits, but usually, more often than not, I am at aperture 1.8. So, moving on to ISO. Now, usually when you're shooting in bright sunlight, you want your ISO to be lower because a higher ISO will lighten the darks in your image and generally make the image even brighter than it already is. Right now, since it's so bright outside, my ISO should be a lot lower because right now it's really bright outside, so my aperture is lower. If I was standing in the sun, like if I was standing, let me move right now and show you. If I'm standing here, right, it would be too much for. If I was standing right here and filming this video, I would need to lower the ISO to about 100 and adjust my other camera settings to make me look less bright because the sun is it's shining right on me, and this is a really bright image to the point where it's too bright. But since I'm in the shade, I heightened the ISO to about 250. So that I am more well lit. I could have put it at 100, which could also work, but if I put it at 100, you see the image is not as bright and I look pretty dark, but the light behind me looks super bright. So this is like a little bit too much of a contrast. So in order to balance the entire image out, I put my ISO at 250, and in that way I was able to make myself look lighter. And I was also able to make sure that this, like, sort of look behind me wasn't so light that you can't see, like, the green in, like, the backyard, you know? So if I was taking a portrait of someone, I would definitely not take a portrait of them with a background like this, because this background is way too light to make a good image. Like, the whites are too bright. It's not a good image because it's just not well balanced. But since I'm filming a video and since I wanted to film today and I really had no other time to film, I decided to make the best of what I could, and I decided to like change the camera settings to make me look as best as I possibly could. So that's pretty much my gist. So a quick run through: if you want your image to be brighter, then you go for a higher ISO. If you want it to be darker, then you go for a lower ISO. So ISO, unlike aperture, it won't affect the blurriness of your image, it will just affect the overall brightness of your image. If you're shooting at night, then I would suggest shooting at a lower aperture to let in a lot more light, but I would be shooting with a higher ISO to let in, again, more light. Right now this is at 6400, so you can see me, right? I'm still in the image, you can see me, but it's so bright that like I'm completely like white, like I'm completely white. But if I go to 3200, it's a little bit better. You can still see me, but right, but it's still too bright. So right now the perfect setting for me is 250, since I'm bright but I'm not so bright that you can't see me, you know, and you can see like everything that's going on in the video, even though it's a little bit bright behind me, but you can still see me. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about is shutter speed. Now this is something that is pretty self-explanatory. Shutter speed is a measure for how long the camera's shutter is open to take the image, how much light is being let in, and how fast the image is taken in general. So there are many different ways to work with this. I tend to keep my shutter speed at around 2/50th of a second, because if I'm shooting someone and they end up moving slightly, I don't want them to be blurry, so I like to keep it at 250. Plus, usually if I'm shooting outside and I'm trying to shoot something and my hand shakes, for instance, if I have it at 2/50th of a second, it will still be a very crisp image because that's a pretty good shutter speed. However, if you want to let in more light, there is a way to let in more light using the shutter speed. And a lower shutter speed is also really fun if you want to create like a super ethereal looking photo. Right now I'm at 1/60th of a second and I look like an angel because I'm so light and bright and so ethereal, right? But this is just a little bit too much for me usually, so I like to keep it at a higher shutter speed if I'm in a very bright situation. Right now I'm back at 2/50th, but let's try an even higher shutter speed. Let's try, for example, 1,000th of a second. See? Again, I'm a lot darker, and the entire image in general is a lot darker because the camera automatically knows that, hey, I will have less time to take this image. So it's already showing me what the image would look like if I was to take a photo. So in videos, I do like to keep my shutter speed at about 250 because that seems to balance out quite nicely with the different ISO and the different aperture that I tend to have. So 250 is kind of like a sweet spot for me. However, if I'm shooting sports or if I'm shooting dance, I like to go even higher. I like to try a very high shutter speed because a lot of times when people are moving really fast, you don't want to get a blurry image because not a lot of blurry images tend to look good. I mean, I've taken blurry images and they look great, but most of the time when I'm taking a photo and it's blurry, it doesn't look great most of the time. So if I'm doing photography in a very fast-paced environment where I see a lot of movement and a lot is going on, I go for a higher shutter speed so I'm able to capture that moment. But if I go at a higher shutter speed, right, and I'm at a football game and I'm trying to shoot the players, then I have to go for a higher ISO and a lower aperture, because if I go at a high shutter speed of let's just say 1,000th of a second, I can shoot the players, right? But as you can tell, the image is darker, and if I'm on the field or if I'm in the stands and it's night, right, and it's a football game, the image is going to be dark as it is, so I have to do everything that I can to balance out the faster shutter speed, but also to balance that out by having a brighter camera setting. So that can be a little bit tricky. That's when you get a lot of grain, because if you take your ISO, for example, and you're in a low light situation, and you basically make it so your ISO is like really high at maybe like 1/2800, then in many cases that is way too high for you not to have grain, and you will have grain. However, you can also go at an ISO of like 800, and usually like almost every newer camera you can go at an ISO of 800 and not have to worry about having any kind of grain or noise. But I typically like to go for a ISO below that usually, because I sometimes am very picky like that. It's just my style of photography. So yeah, that has been a long video. I was going to make it a lot more brief, but I just really wanted to give you as much information as possible so you can have a full understanding of camera settings and how to manipulate them for your own benefit. So thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. I hope it was helpful to you and that you now have a good understanding of camera settings, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys.